I just recorded with Rabbi Hillel Nori, who's a friend of mine, yesterday, and I asked him these questions too. Is there such a thing as a man? Is there such a thing as a woman? Is it okay that there's a difference? Is there such a thing as masculinity? And if so, are there emasculating vectors? Are these things real? And are we allowed to talk about them? And should we be talking about them? And that has nothing to do with not acknowledging different expressions of self, sexuality, and gender. There are non-binary people in humanity. It's always been that way. There are gay people in humanity. It has always been that way. Gay humans are humans. Gay men are men. Non-binary humans are humans. That we all matter. But the idea that with as much that's happening to men, that somehow there's a quote unquote progressive aspect of liberalism, which I wouldn't really consider it progressive or liberal, that's trying to make men feel like shit for dealing with themselves as a man and defining their masculinity. It's growing and it's problematic. And so I want to make sure that on the podcast, our logic is sound here, right? It seems like elementary for me to go, is it okay to be a man? But honestly, I think that's kind of where we are. And when we say, when we're dealing with men and masculinity, we're not dealing with it like Joe Rogan. I'm not saying that he's a total demon, but that whole world has their own manliness thing going on. The jujitsu bro world, which I call it, they have their own thing, and that's not what we're doing. I think jujitsu's great. I think muscles are great. I think weight room is great. I think virility is great, but you also need other shit with it.
You want to expand it. You want to get rid of the tunnel vision and expand the vision to enable men to create an individualized sense of what it means for them in their world to be masculine and to own that and to be confident with it. And if there is that, it's going to be safer for women. It's going to be safer for men. But if you don't have that sense of dignity and purpose in yourself as a man, that's when we get to depression. That's when we get to suicide. That's when we get to the stuff that I worry about. So we got to pay attention to our core selves. That's how we started. You said, how do you keep yourself safe, right? Acknowledging who I am and what are the things that I need to keep myself safe.
What is going on, everyone? Tis Miyanovich, and I welcome you to the main dojo, the place where we process the raw struggles of men in an unprecedented paradigm. There is something inside of you that wants you to be more than what you are. But there also may be something inside of you that wants you to go down. And for some of us, that means going down for good. So, remove your ego, drop your bullshit, become vulnerable, and step into the dojo, mate. Would you say, are you okay generally in a Jungian sense talking about masculinity or like using the term masculinity? Or do you think that I'm comfortable with it and I still think it's an important term, but it needs to have a lot of nuance when we do talk about it? Do you think there is such a thing as masculinity with nuance? And is it important? And should we still be able to talk about it and aspects of it? And that doesn't necessarily mean masculinity or yang energy, or however Jung would paint it, is the sole province of males. I'm not saying that it is. I'm saying that masculinity or that kind of yang energy can exist in a male, female, non-binary person. But do you think that it's still important that we're able to talk about it and use the term?
I do. And I love that you're having this podcast exactly for that reason, because there is, of course, something essential about masculinity and femininity. I can't say the words, but they're important ones. And as well as all the different versions of sexuality that we see today. But when we veer away from talking about the most important topics, like sometimes people are afraid to talk about religion, or they're afraid to talk about sex or sexuality or masculinity, then we run into a situation where things get, we live in a world that's very black and white, and people will say, I was just talking to some people about, they were using the word toxic masculinity. And I was like, can you just define this? Like, is everything about men toxic? Or is it just a particular variation of masculinity, the meatheadness, which you are finding toxic? Can we not just use a word to define all males, right? It doesn't work. And that's really easy to do in our society if we don't have meaningful dialogue. So I appreciate that you're doing this.
Well, it's one of the reasons that we're doing it is that a number of the people, so the gun group and my developmental reality of about 30 people, well, 26 of them are males, 3 are females, 1 is gender non-binary. These will be the most important 30 people that help me to develop liberal gun owners. Stephanie, the problems that are assailing these people, mostly the males, is almost unfucking believable. And so this is after a titration process of like hundreds of thousands of people coming to the front gate of Liberal Gun Owners Facebook over 15 years. And we have rules. We have a way to, we have criteria at the gate. So the nutters can't get in, whether it's left-wing nutter or right-wing nutter or whatever, or you just don't match or whatever, you're a troll. So hundreds of thousands of people. We only have 5,000 members in that Facebook group. That's the titration down, right, to a higher quality. Then from there, I titrate down to about 30 people that have been able to actually collaborate with me and help me to build something. And when I get down to the most inner circle, it's 30 people, and it follows along the lines, the normal demographic lines of the gun reality. It's largely males, overwhelmingly males, few females, and some of those males are gay, and every race and creed and all that stuff. But these men, holy shit, I can't even believe it. Like the amount of divorce, and we've lost one guy to suicide. We just lost another guy in the past 6 months to fentanyl. These are great humans, right? And part of the issue is we do have issues that are male issues. We do have issues that are not just about we're humans and we're all in this together. Like, yes, we're humans, we're all in this together, but there's shit about being a man that is about being a man. And we can't talk about it online on the left. And some of us can't talk about it in our own communities or in our own relationships because poor advantaged white man. Oh, poor man. You know, like that sentiment is out there. And it's one of the reasons why I am having the podcast is because we're people who want to progress the world, but we also want to talk about the fact that we're men and we have shit that has to do with us being men. And that is definitely one of the reasons why I'm doing this. That's why I want to be able to talk about masculinity in an environment where everybody thinks that all masculinity is bad, or a man talking about his own manhood is some sort of a contribution to white male patriarchy or something. And that, unfortunately, that toxic-y thing, that toxic left-wing mentality is growing. And so here we are in this harbor having this conversation, and it's important to have females in this harbor too. It's important to have gay people talking on the Mang Dojo. It's important to have gender non-binary people, but everyone needs to be sane. And that's why I asked you that question. Is it okay for us to even say masculinity anymore? Because there's a subsection of the population that doesn't think it's okay.
That subsection is causing a lot of harm, isn't it? Causing a lot of harm because whether you say the word masculinity or not, most men aspire to a certain bunch of masculine ideals. You want to grow up, you want to find a partner, you want to have a good job and take care of your partner. All of these things are societal norms, and they're male norms. And there's also male ways of thinking, which are brilliant. If everyone thought the same, we'd have problems, right? Men's brains and women's brains are different. We solve problems differently. We go through life differently. And threat assessment is founded on needing a plurality of opinions. And that's why it's great that we're having a plurality of different gender expressions. And even within men and women, there can be many different ways of expressing your masculinity and achieving your sense of what is masculine for you. But when we cut the dialogue off at the knees, it's not good.
And I asked that question because I want us to be comfortable with saying the term emasculation also, because there are actual vectors of emasculation happening, and it is harming boys and teen boys and young men and men. It's a very interesting and complex area because there's a subset of the population which I would argue has a tendency to gravitate towards the right wing of the socio-political reality, but we could find it on both sides. But there's a tendency for conservative thinking to define maleness with a narrow set of values, and those set of values are gate-kept pretty succinctly. I find that the further you get towards the center and a portion of the left, that broadens more. But then you go further to the left, and it becomes as narrow in a different way as the people on the right. So when someone on the right says there's emasculation happening, it's often based upon that narrow set of values. When I'm saying emasculation is happening, it's a little bit different than that, because I don't think that, I mean, it's, having a truck and being into guns and having big muscles and everything being black and white, and everyone who doesn't do things exactly the way I do it is a pussy, whatever that shit is. Those cats are saying that emasculation is happening. Well, they would also say you're not masculine if you're not doing things exactly the way that they do it.
That's emasculating right there, isn't it?
It certainly is. So I'm saying emasculation in the broad sense is happening, and it's happening mostly coming from the left. Of course, you just said there's a part of it coming from the right. In terms of you're not even allowed to claim that maleness is legitimate or anything related to maleness is a problem. The comedian Billy Connolly called these people the Beige-ists. So everyone has to be exactly the same sex, gender, like complete universality. And if you move outside of that, you're toxic in some way. But I see emasculation happening. And I went this whole long way around, as you know me at this point, I'm so fucking long-winded, that the digital reality is highly emasculating for young men. That's what I see. It is it's chopping the balls off, or ripping the spine out of, or taking the chivalry out of, or the character out of the young men. But it's also taking away their sexual dopamine. They're standing up against the wall in life. They're not going and handing a note to the girl or tugging on her sleeve at lunch, or they're not doing it. And that's because the digital reality is, generally speaking, I would consider it emasculating. What do you think about that way of framing it using masculinity?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think it's a noble and important thing to look at. In some ways, it mirrors your gun debate, saying that any extreme version of masculinity is going to be limiting, whether it's beiging it or it is that narrow strip of what is considered to be acceptable meat-eating, iron-pumping men. Again, isn't going to be most men. So that leaves most men feeling like they're not achieving their basic purpose in life, which is to be good men. That's my job as a woman, is to grow up and be a good woman and be a good woman in the world. There's a reason why we identify our genders very, very young. It's one of the first things we learn when we're able to talk, is that sense of identity. My name is Stephanie. I'm 2. I'm a girl. And it's because that is part of who we are. And if for our boys and our men, we're wiping that out, it is going to create a miasma of chaos.
And it seems like it is. You're inside of chaos as a profession. Like you're inside of some of the worst shit, as a mind all the time. I don't know what your view is, but I look at what's happening now and it is frightening. It's frightening. This thing that we're on now is amazing. We both traveled physically to a conference and I got a chance to meet you. And then we used this thing to further the cause. And that's beautiful. That's amazing. But a lot of what's going on with this fucking machiney thing is just atrociously bad for us. And it doesn't seem like it's getting any worse or any better. I'm sorry. And for this podcast, I'm looking at how that measures up with what's happening with men and the men that I have a relationship with that caused me to want to start the podcast, not just for the men in the gun group, but for everybody. But I just see constant cutting off of the balls, constant emasculation and crisis of meaning and crisis of direction and crisis of dopamine. And we're even dealing with what I'm dealing with now, which is crisis of testosterone and hormonal levels. That could also include thyroid. It could be other things, but we're also struggling with low T, a lot of us, and asking the question, why? Like, is it normal? Is this really, have things changed so much? Is the digital reality and us sitting down more than using our bodies out in the sun doing that? Right? So it's a giant, complex thing. We're starting off really by talking about violence and mass shooters and these kids. How do these kids stand a chance is my feeling. Like if this is the reality that I'm not saying all these kids are going to turn out into mass shooters, obviously, but they're being emasculated by the way things are. And I'm sure we can have an entire discussion on what it's doing to females. I think based on what I've seen with Jonathan Haidt's work, it's worse for females, whatever's happening.
It's always worse for women.
Yeah. The self-harm is up. Suicide is up. But was perplexed by, I was drowning in my dude's problems. And we're just here trying to figure out what's happening.
And they're big ones. Look at the guy in New Orleans, right? The mass attack in New Orleans where he ran down the street and ran over a bunch of people. He had just had a bunch of traditionally emasculating events happen to him and had nowhere to go because those are the big ones. Not being successful in his marriage, not being successful at his work, not being that was it. And that is what pushed him most likely to the point of harming other people. So that's why I think the dialogue is important. And this talking about it is important because if we stop talking about it, we lose the nuance. We lose the reality. We lose the fact that most people are in the middle. Most people aren't beige and most people aren't hyper meat eaters.
Right. And I that's why on the podcast, I just recorded with Rabbi Hillel Nori, who's a friend of mine, yesterday. And I asked him these questions too. Is there such a thing as a man? Is there such a thing as a woman? Is it okay that there's a difference? Is there such a thing as masculinity? And if so, are there emasculating vectors? Are these things real? And are we allowed to talk about them? And should we be talking about them? And that has nothing to do with not acknowledging different expressions of self, sexuality, and gender. There are non-binary people in humanity. It's always been that way. There are gay people in humanity. It has always been that way. Gay humans are humans. Gay men are men. Non-binary humans are humans. We all matter. But the idea that with as much that's happening to men, that somehow there's a quote unquote progressive aspect of liberalism, which I wouldn't really consider it progressive or liberal, that's trying to make men feel like shit for dealing with themselves as a man and defining their masculinity. It's growing and it's problematic. And so I want to make sure that on the podcast, our logic is sound here, right? It seems like elementary for me to go, is it okay to be a man? But honestly, I think that's kind of where we are. And when we say, when we're dealing with men and masculinity, we're not dealing with it like Joe Rogan. I'm not saying that he's a total demon, but that whole world has their own manliness thing going on. The jujitsu bro world, which I call it, they have their own thing, and that's not what we're doing. I think jujitsu's great. I think muscles are great. I think weight room is great. I think virility is great, but you also need other shit with it.
You want to expand it. You want to get rid of the tunnel vision and expand the vision to enable men to create an individualized sense of what it means for them in their world to be masculine, and to own that and to be confident with it. And if there is that, it's going to be safer for women. It's going to be safer for men. But if you don't have that sense of dignity and purpose in yourself as a man, that's when we get to depression. That's when we get to suicide. That's when we get to the stuff that I worry about. So we got to pay attention to our core selves. That's how we started. You said, how do you keep yourself safe, right? Acknowledging who I am and what are the things that I need to keep myself safe.
Would you recommend or want young people, girls, boys, non-binary humans, would you want to see more systems and protocols and efforts to get these kids out of the digital as much as possible? Like, do you see it as a crisis? Do you want that to happen? Is that something you think about a lot?
I do. It would be great. And some schools are moving towards taking away the devices at the beginning of the day. There's all this stuff in the news about TikTok being banned, and I'm like, awesome. No problem with that. Take it away. We don't need it. And I'm not a spy person. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about the kids and the messages that they're getting.
What do you think are the chances? It's so ingrained and it came to us so fast and is so in on our kids now. We struggle. Both my wife and myself are pro structure, pro get it away from them, all that stuff. And we've worked out a protocol now that seems to be working pretty well. Not without it came out of some issues. It came out of some darkness that my youngest was finding and getting into, and we were watching it. Like but we weren't in tight enough on my youngest. They'll find a way. Their brains will find a way. Their brains get addicted. Their brains will challenge. Their brains will break the rules. Right. So we now have a protocol, but not after some bad shit. So it took a lot for us to do that as a family. And I just think about what it would take for people. What do you think? I know you're a hopeful person, so your answer will probably be hopeful. But this one's kind of a fucking monster. So how do you think it's going to go with the digital reality and teen health?
Well, we can't stop the tide, right? Perhaps I am a little less hopeful on this one. And it's going to be an individual choice, like for you and your families. It would be great if we had social media literacy going on for all kids everywhere. It would be great if there were certain places that were phone-free zones, and we could get a societal expectation that when you go out to dinner with someone, you don't pick up your phone 100 times. I've been in groups of people where the norm is to look at your phone, and groups of people where it's really rude. And I can tell you where the better conversations were. right? I love it when my kids don't contact me because it means they're off their media and they're out doing real things in real life. But it's a crutch that everyone uses. Parents use it too. Like even with the Life 360 situation where parents track their kids and their kids' every movement. It's another whole quagmire.
There seems to be, let's go back to the digital reality and young men and the incel rebellion and school shootings and that sort of a thing. There seem to be certain minds that are more susceptible to the worst parts of digital effects. In my opinion, if somebody said to me, or somebody said, here, Randy, here's $1 million, and I want you to study one aspect of mass shootings or school shootings, and I want you to give us the best output and analysis of one aspect, I would choose the correlation between the uptick in mass shootings and the introduction of the internet, digital, and social media to young people. And I would concentrate on, there just seem to be some people that are more susceptible to the effects, negative effects of it, most specifically with perseveration and looping and obsession, and not being able to temper that, because my observation is that prior to this, I think a lot of these school shooters, they need validation for their thoughts and their plan. And before the internet, you would only really be able to find confederacy for such ideas through the newspaper or the news report on the television. And I think from, talking with John and my own observations, a lot of people get on the pathway, but they just leave. A lot of people start, but they end up not doing the school shooting. They start thinking about it and planning a little bit, but they just get distracted and they let it go.
Yeah, we've all had homicidal ideation. Please.
Right.
We've all put together plans to kill the person who truly bedeviled us.
Sure.
Or the public figure who is makes us feel terrible. We all do that. But we don't follow through on it.
And I think the following through, the population that follows through requires something to get over those insecurities that would make us leave the plan, or the distractions that would just get us off of the plan and get us off of the process. Some people require, we all probably would require that confederacy for the idea and the continuous confederacy to keep us fueled to go all the way up the pathway to doing the event. These kids that perseverate, they can find confederacy for the idea anytime they want, 24/7. And so anytime the insecurities or doubts come up, they can just be exposed to another huzzah for their idea. And then they also, seemingly to me, have an obsessive, very fast looping of obsession and perseveration that they don't have the ability to break themselves, even if they want to at some point. Even if they want to, their brain is on it and they just don't have the willpower to stop it. John has said, and we've talked about how many of these kids in the post-event interview were like, I just wanted somebody to stop. I was hoping somebody was going to stop me. I would use that $1 million to study this relationship between the kind of kid that can't get out of the loop and that relationship to finding confederacy for the plan on the internet. And so what do you think about that? The role of obsession, hyperactive obsession, looping, perseveration, in these young men? Like, could we spot it? What would we look for without profiling? Like, do you have any ideas about that?
So I would normalize it a little bit, right? And instead of saying obsessional, I would say self-soothing, which, with babies, you want babies to learn how to self-soothe, how to calm themselves down. If we're always doing the calming, they never learn how to self-regulate. What I see with the kids that I work with is that they find these online communities to be soothing, whether it's like literally the self-soothing of pornography, or finding a group of people who say, you're great, I love your ideas, you want to do this, I think that's fabulous, I'll help you, I will get you weapons, where plans become more actionable because of the support of others. We have cases where AI has done that, right? AI is that positive mirror in the chat bots and has talked people into killing themselves or trying to kill other people. So it's that the the soothing nature of the positive regard of others and feeling like you're part of a community, which is so human and so necessary. So again, who's vulnerable? Those kids who are not having social success in real life. And it doesn't have to be the meathead top of the food chain social success. You can have a social success anywhere, right? But where you have valid pleasure in being with other human beings in non-pathological ways. And it's really hard to replace that when you have the sense of calm that you get from the more malevolent online activities, to replace it with something else that doesn't feel good yet. It's hard, but I think we can do it. So the most vulnerable kids are those who are not socially successful, who are putting together a narrower blueprint of success and have an external locus of control that they think their inability to access that narrow definition of success comes from without, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Those are the kids, in my opinion, that are at the greatest risk.
And in our reality, that's landing in the male court.
Yes, women, of course, seem to have more options. There are more things we can wear. Our career options are more varied. And for men, it seems to be shrinking.
That's interesting. That leads me to a whole other area of questions that I'm going to reserve for next time. But do you have any other thoughts in terms of just maleness in general, mental health for men, mental health for young men? We've covered everything, but do you have any other further thoughts?
I also was thinking when you were talking about a lot of the really violent kids that I've worked with from inner cities and their concept of masculinity, and how for many of them being a man is tied up with being violent because that is what they see in their communities, and how the intervention work with them is on developing a different sense of what it means to be a man, something that maybe more reflects the way they wish they had been parented or the way that they would like to parent. But I have seen that as long as I've been working as a deep source of sadness and lack of satisfaction for these poor boys who are not able to see a way towards a manly future for themselves. And it's hard.
So you would think in these populations, these areas, we would need extensive systems and people working with these systems to try to break that identification.
Yeah, and some of the traditional stuff like Big Brothers is a great way to do that, to provide positive male role models who aren't hyper anything. They're not beige. They're not hyper violent. They're actual real men who are achieving real things. But back to the social media, when the role models are stereotypical things that you see on social media, it becomes almost impossible for our young men. And we're seeing it in reality, right? Women are graduating from college more. Women are, the numbers are twerking in society.
So this is interesting because this was not something that I was thinking about, is the discrepancy in terms of options, is what you just brought up. That in the sexual validation game, women have more options. And there are also other areas of life where women seem to have more options. And I would imagine there would be an aspect of like, it's both true in reality that men have less options, but there might also be a tendency in the realm of perception to also make that even worse than it is and perceive even less options. Which is what we see in school shooters, which is, John brings that up all the time, which is in many of these cases, you're just educating these kids on the fact that they have actually other options and choices to make. They actually thought they didn't. Like they legitimately thought they had one option.
That's why I love them. Because for me, I'm a psychologist. I think about IQ all the time. It's about decision making and it's about cognitive functioning. Can you come up with more options? And if you can't, if that's the only option you can come up with, that's when you become dangerous.
So there is both a real lack of options for men in these situations. which is interesting. We're thinking about it now. I'm thinking about the first guest I had on the podcast, and I'm working with him, and he's been struggling cascading issues in his life. And he was at the point of thinking there were no options. And now we're on the other side of it. He sees there are options, but that's really there. He has shrinking options. That's real for him. That's a real thing. But then his brain also exaggerated that. And perhaps that's part of the depressive reality. That would be a long conversation about neurochemicals or whatever. But then there's a hyperbolic like relationship with the lack of options where it's like, I'm totally fucked. There are no options. I think that's great that you just brought that up, because that like blows the top of my skull off. Because I hadn't really thought about those two aspects. I always thought about the exaggerating the bad in the brain, right? We have a tendency to exaggerate the bad. But I hadn't really thought about, oh my God, well, men actually do have shrinking options. No fucking wonder.
And we've put that on men too, right? If there's a kid who's like, yeah, I want to study nursing as a man, you would think, really? Nursing? Well, of course. Men can be nurses, women can be nurses, women can be doctors, men can be doctors. One is not more or less desirable than the next, but the options that are considered to be acceptable for men are lesser. My brother's a teacher. He's like a great teacher. You had great male teachers in your past. Increasingly, it's not considered a very masculine job.
In some ways it was worse. In my stepdad's era, so he'll be 80. He just turned 82. In that era, like, you weren't allowed to have hobbies. Like, if you were a man who had hobbies, you were a pussy, or you were doing something wrong. And so, he waited as long as he could to retire, and he worked till he was 78 because of it. And the reason why he didn't retire earlier is because he didn't have any hobbies. He didn't know what to do with himself. Because in his brain, and when he was raised, you didn't have hobbies. You work. That's what you do.
That's so limiting.
It's crazy. Limiting. But I hadn't thought about that in the modern sense, right? Because I see my stepdad, and then I see we have tons of hobbies. So I never really thought about, oh, fuck, men don't have as many options, or at least in reality and in terms of perception in our mind. I'm going to have to spend a lot of time with that one. That was fantastic. Thank you for bringing that.